the gavel came down, and the sound was like a bone breaking in the silent, stuffy air of the courtroom. And for the first time, the smirk on the 10-year-old girl's face didn't just falter. It shattered. It was replaced by a raw, bottomless terror she never knew she could feel. Her tiny hands, which had been folded so smugly on the table, clenched into white-knuckled fists. Her breath hitched. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. Her age was her armor. Her intelligence, her weapon. She had played the game perfectly, she thought. But the sentence was a void, and it was swallowing her whole. You could see the calculation behind her eyes short-circuiting, replaced by the one thing she never accounted for: pure, undiluted fear. This, right here, is the story of Alara Vance. A child prodigy from a picture-perfect neighborhood who thought she'd committed the perfect crime. She believed the world was a simple puzzle, and that she was the only player who understood how all the pieces fit together. She looked at adults and saw slow, sentimental creatures, bound by rules she could twist. She was so clever. And she was wrong. This is how the arrogant monster, hidden in plain sight, was unmasked. But before we step into the pristine, deceptive world of Cedar Creek, I have to ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Is it raining where you are, washing the streets clean like it did the night of the murder? Or is it perfectly, unervingly still? Wherever you are, whatever the weather, pull up a chair. This is a story you'll want to follow to the very end. If you're ready to see how it all unravels, hit subscribe. And let's begin. To understand the monster, you first have to understand its habitat. So let's take a walk, you and I. Let's step into Cedar Creek. It's one of those places that looks like it's been pulled from a magazine. The lawns are unervingly vibrant green, each blade of grass cut with a military precision. The houses are big, but not ostentatious, painted in quiet, respectable colors. The streets curve in gentle, predictable arcs, and on a Tuesday afternoon, the only sound is the distant whir of a lawnmower and the occasional polite echo of a screen door closing. But if you stay here long enough, you start to feel it. The silence isn't peaceful. It's watchful. The perfect lawns feel less like a choice and more like a mandate. This is a community that specializes in keeping up appearances, in sweeping dust under immaculately clean rugs. And no house on Hemlock Drive was better at that than the Vance residence. Now, picture the inside. It's all cool grays and sterile whites. Everything is in its place. There are no messy stacks of mail on the counter, no toys littering the living room floor. It smells of lemony disinfectant and faintly, of untouched air. This isn't a home that's lived in, it's a home that is maintained. Her parents, Richard and Caroline Vance, are like pleasant ghosts in their own house. Successful, well-dressed, and perpetually busy, speaking to each other and to Alara in a series of polite, scheduled interactions. "How was school, dear?" "Fine. Good." And in the center of this beautiful, empty museum was Alara, 10 years old, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes so blue they seemed to absorb the light. To her teachers, she was a prodigy, effortlessly acing every test. To her parents, she was a quiet, low-maintenance daughter who never caused trouble. They saw a composed, intelligent child. But if you looked closer, and we're going to look closer, the composition was a little terrifying. Her room was the one place that reflected its true occupant. It was neat, but not like the rest of the house. This was the neatness of a laboratory. Books on advanced chemistry and human psychology were shelved not by author, but by subject and perceived usefulness. On her desk sat a high-powered microscope, a gift for her 9th birthday. There were no stuffed animals. No posters of pop stars. Instead, there was a single framed print of a complex, unsolvable geometric puzzle. And then there was the journal. A beautiful leather-bound thing she kept locked with a small, brass key she wore around her neck. This was her only confidant. Inside weren't the crushes or dreams of a typical girl her age. They were observations. Notes on the behavior of her peers, ranked by predictability and emotional volatility. Diagrams of the ant colonies she'd methodically dissected in the backyard. She saw the world as a series of systems to be mastered, and people as the most fascinating, and ultimately, simple systems of all. She felt nothing but a mild contempt for their messy emotions, their predictable routines. She was the smartest person in her world, and she knew it. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous belief a person can ever have. So that was the stage. A quiet street. A quiet house. A quiet, brilliant girl. It was all so perfectly, painfully normal on the surface. But can you feel it? The pressure building? That's the thing about monsters that hide in plain sight. They make you think the quiet is safe. They make you think the smile is innocent. But Ilara Vance was waiting. She was bored. And a bored genius is a bomb just waiting for a fuse. The fuse was lit on a Thursday evening, with a storm brewing over Cedar Creek. The air was thick and heavy, and the first fat drops of rain were just starting to hit the windows like impatient ticks of a clock. Ilara's parents were heading out for a fundraiser, all crisp tuxedos and shimmering dresses. And that meant it was a babysitter night. Enter Arthur Clay. He was in his late 60s, a retired biology teacher with kind eyes and a bottomless well of patience. He didn't need the money, he just liked kids. Or he liked the idea of them. He saw Ilara as a fascinating, budding scientific mind. He'd bring her puzzles, books on astronomy, little challenges to engage her. He was the only adult who didn't seem intimidated by her intelligence. He was, in his own gentle way, trying to reach her. That was his first mistake. That night, he proposed a game, a complex logic puzzle involving chess pieces and a timer. Ilara solved it in under a minute, her expression bored. She retreated to her room, dismissing him. Arthur, a little disappointed, decided to make them both hot chocolate, a sentimental gesture she would surely find pointless. As he moved around the kitchen, a gust of wind rattled the house, and a draft from a poorly sealed window blew a single, loose sheet of paper out from under the door of Ilara's room. It fluttered into the hall like a fallen leaf. Arthur picked it up, intending to slide it back. But the words on the page caught his eye. It wasn't a school assignment. It was a log, written in Ilara's precise, looping handwriting. The heading read, Subject 7, Domestic Shorthair, Feline. What followed were cold, clinical notes. Observations on fear responses. Pain thresholds. Time to termination. The methods were creative. Arthur's blood ran cold. This wasn't the curious dissection of a frog. This was something else entirely. This was a record of cruelty, methodical and detached. The kind, teacherly part of him took over. He wasn't angry, he was concerned. This was a cry for help, he thought. A brilliant mind going down a dark path that needed correcting. He found her in her room, organizing her specimens. He held up the paper, his hand trembling slightly. "Ilara," he said, his voice soft but serious. "We need to talk about this. This isn't right. This isn't science." Ilara turned. She didn't look startled. She didn't look guilty. She looked inconvenienced. Like he was a bug that had wandered onto her clean, sterile workspace. Her eyes flicked from the paper to his face, and he saw something in them he'd never seen before, a complete and utter absence of warmth. A flat, cold calculation. "You went through my things?" Her voice was dangerously quiet. "It blew out, Ilara. That's not the point. The point is what this says. What you've been doing." He took a step forward, his expression full of grandfatherly concern. "We have to tell your parents. They can get you help." That was his final and fatal mistake. He said, "we." He assumed he was still part of a team trying to help a child. Ilara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him, this sentimental, slow, predictable old man, and in that single stretched-out moment, she made a decision. He was no longer Mr. Clay, the babysitter. He was a variable, a loose end, a problem that required a permanent solution. The storm outside broke, the rain lashing against the windows, but the real storm was right here, in this room, silent and deadly. The game was over. A new one was about to begin. The moment Arthur Clay said the words, "your parents," Ilara's plan clicked into place, fully formed, as if it had been waiting in the shadows of her mind all along. There was no panic, No frantic rush. She looked at the terrified old man and simply saw a set of problems to be solved. The first problem was him. The second was the scene. The third was the story. "You're right, Mr. Clay," she said, her voice shifting, adopting a mask of shaky remorse. She even managed to make her eyes glisten. I don't know what's wrong with me. It's like a compulsion." She let a tear trace a perfect path down her cheek. She saw his expression soften, the teacher in him responding to a student in apparent distress. He took a step closer, ready to comfort. That was all the invitation she needed. The murder itself was efficient. She didn't have the strength for a struggle, so she didn't engage in one. As he reached out to pat her shoulder, she sidestepped with a dancer's grace and picked up the heavy, solid brass bookend from her shelf, a gift for her spelling bee win. It was shaped like an owl. Ironic, the symbol of wisdom. She didn't swing it in rage. She brought it down in one sharp, focused arc, like a surgeon making an incision. The thud was sickeningly soft, muffled by the raging storm outside. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. She stood over him, watching for a moment, not with horror, but with a critical eye. Was he still breathing? She checked his pulse with 2 fingers, the way she'd seen on television. Nothing. Problem 1, solved. Now, for the scene. This is where her brilliance, her true arrogance, shone. She worked methodically, a director staging her masterpiece. First, the break-in. She unlocked the back kitchen window, using a towel to avoid prints, and smashed the pane from the inside, scattering glass across the linoleum floor. She reached through the broken window to unlock it from the outside, making it look forced. She then took a handful of mud from the pot of a dying houseplant and smeared it on the windowsill, both inside and out. Next, the theft. She went to her mother's jewelry box, but she wasn't greedy. That would look suspicious. She took only a few pieces, a diamond necklace, a pair of pearl earrings, items that were valuable but not flashy. She tossed a drawer in her parents' bedroom, just enough to suggest a frantic search. Then, the body. She dragged Mr. Clay, a difficult, grisly task, into the main hallway, the foyer. This was crucial. A burglary gone wrong. The burglar gets surprised by the babysitter. A struggle ensues. She placed a fallen lamp nearby, for good measure. Finally, herself. She went into the downstairs bathroom. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. This was her performance. She ruffled her perfect hair. She pinched her own cheeks until they were red. Then she took a deep breath, and with a calm that is utterly chilling to consider, she slammed her own small fist into the bathroom doorframe. The pain was sharp, bright. It made her eyes water for real this time. A perfect, believable injury for a child who fought off an attacker and hid. She settled into the hall closet, deep in the shadows behind the winter coats. She pulled the door almost shut, leaving a crack to see the front door. She arranged her face into the picture of terror. Her breathing hitched. Her body trembled. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the genius. She was Ilara Vance, the victim. The perfect little girl, hiding from the bad man. And then, she waited. The storm raged on, washing the world clean outside. But inside the house on Hemlock Drive, the stains were just beginning to set. The key turned in the front door at exactly 10:47 p.m. Richard and Caroline Vance were laughing, a light, champagne-fueled sound that died the second the door swung open. The laughter was cut off by a silent, awful gasp. The hall light was out. The storm had passed, leaving a dripping, eerie quiet outside, but inside, the world had been shattered. Caroline's scream wasn't loud at first. It was a strangled thing, caught in her throat at the sight of Arthur Clay's body, splayed and still on their expensive Persian rug. Richard fumbled for the light switch. The scene exploded into view. The fallen lamp, the muddy footprints Ilara had meticulously planted, the glitter of broken glass from the kitchen beyond. It was a perfect painting of chaos. Then, a sound. A tiny, muffled whimper. It came from the hall closet. Richard, his heart hammering against his ribs, yanked the door open. And there she was. Huddled among the coats, her face streaked with real tears born of pain and effort, her knuckles swollen and already bruising. She was shaking, but as she launched herself into her father's arms, the shake felt practiced. The sobs were a little too rhythmic. "A man," she choked out, her voice a masterpiece of trembling terror. "A big man. He hit Mr. Clay, and I ran, and I hid." The police and paramedics arrived in a whirl of flashing lights and static radio voices. The quiet street of Cedar Creek was now a crime scene. Neighbors watched from behind their blinds, their perfect world ruptured. Ilara was wrapped in a foil blanket, a classic image of victimhood. She clung to her mother, burying her face, performing the role of a lifetime for an audience of trained professionals. And they bought it. Of course they did. She was a 10-year-old girl from a good home, found hiding in a closet after a traumatic event. The story was flawless. The broken window, the stolen jewels, the staged struggle. They spoke to her in soft, gentle voices. They told her she was brave. They said she was safe. But there was one person, a young, fresh-faced paramedic, who would later give a statement that stuck in Detective Rostova's mind. He had been checking Ilara's injured hand. As he gently wrapped it, he looked into her eyes. And for a split second, as she glanced over his shoulder at the body bag being zipped closed, he didn't see fear. He didn't see trauma. He saw something else, a flicker of cold, analytical assessment. Like a director checking a final shot. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a fresh wave of tears. He dismissed it, of course. He told himself it was shock. What else could it be? But we know, don't we? That was the crack. Tiny, invisible to almost everyone, but it was there. The first tear she shed was real, from the pain in her hand. Everyone after that was just part of the script. While the Vance house was swarming with uniforms, a different kind of presence arrived. Detective Eva Rostova. She didn't make a grand entrance. She stood on the periphery for a long moment, just watching, her hands buried in the pockets of her worn trench coat. She had a face that had seen too many broken things, and the energy of a storm cloud that had finally settled. She was in her late 40s, with eyes that didn't just look at you, they seemed to look through you, sifting through the layers. And she saw ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that leave echoes in a crime scene. The ghost she carried with her was named Lucas Miller, a 15-year-old boy from a case 2 years prior. Charismatic, brilliant, and a pathological liar. He'd manipulated his entire school, his family, and nearly the entire justice system, convinced his intellect was a get-out-of-jail-free card for arson. He almost got away with it. Rostova was the only one who saw the cold calculation behind the charming smile. She'd broken him, but it had cost her a piece of her soul. Lucas Miller was the ghost that now walked with her into every room, especially rooms with clever, manipulative children. She stepped inside, nodding at the officers. She didn't go straight to the body. She took in the entire ecosystem of the crime. She saw the broken window, the mud, the tossed drawer. It was all so textbook. It was like a checklist from a true crime documentary. Too perfect. Too compliant. A real burglary is messy, frantic. This one felt like a performance. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on Ilara, who was now sipping water from a paper cup, still wrapped in that foil blanket, playing the part of the shell-shocked victim to a rapt audience of her parents and a social worker. Rostova watched her. She saw the way Ilara's eyes, for a fraction of a second, darted around the room, taking in the police work, assessing. It wasn't the gaze of a terrified child. It was the gaze of a quality control inspector. Rostova finally approached the family. She introduced herself, her voice low and calm, devoid of the sugary sympathy everyone else was using. She knelt down, not to condescend, but to be at eye level with Ilara. "Ilara," she said. "My name is Eva. I'm a detective. I need to ask you a very important question. Can you be brave for me?" Ilara nodded, her eyes welling up on cue. The man was big," she whispered. "I'm sure he was," Rostova said, her tone neutral. Then she asked her question. It wasn't about the man's height, or his clothes, or what he took. It was simpler, deeper. "Ilara, When you were hiding in the closet, what did you smell? There was a pause. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of confusion in Alara's blue eyes. Smell? She hadn't prepared for smell. The script didn't include that. She faltered. I don't know. I was scared. It's okay, Rostova said softly, but her own internal alarms were screaming. A real victim's senses are overloaded. They remember the gritty details, the smell of wet wool, the taste of fear, the texture of the dust on the floor. They don't recite a pre-rehearsed description of the perpetrator. Rostova stood up, her knees cracking. She looked at the grieving parents, the sympathetic officers, the perfect little girl. And she knew. She felt the same chilling presence she'd felt with Lucas Miller. This wasn't a home invasion. This was a play. And the director was sitting right there, wrapped in a foil blanket. The ghost of Lucas Miller wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a warning. And as Rostova turned to leave the scene, her mind was already racing, not about finding a mysterious burglar, but about how to prove that the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone was trying to comfort. Detective Rostova didn't storm the Vance house with a warrant. She moved like water, slow and persistent, wearing down the resistance of the parents. It's procedure, she told them, her voice a low, reassuring hum. We need to rule everything out, for Alara's sake. And so, a team of forensics experts, under her calm direction, began to process the house. Not as a burglary scene anymore, but as something else entirely. They found the journal exactly where Rostova expected it to be. Not buried in the backyard or hidden in a floorboard. That would be for someone who felt guilt, who feared discovery. Alara felt neither. The journal was on her bookshelf, tucked between a thick volume on forensic science and a biography of Marie Curie. It was hidden in the most obvious place for a genius who believed no one else was smart enough to understand her work. The brass lock was a formality, a prop. It took the forensic tech about 30 seconds to open it without damaging it. Rostova took the journal to the sterile, bright lights of the police station. She laid it on her desk, a cup of cold coffee beside it. And then she began to read. And what she found there, it wasn't a diary. It was a lab report from hell. The early entries were almost charming, if you didn't know where they were leading. Subject 1. Common ant colony. Disrupted pheromone trails. Observed collective confusion. Termination via magnifying glass. Efficiency high. There were detailed diagrams, notes on reaction times. But then the subjects got bigger. Subject 3, a neuron, frog. Tested pain response to various stimuli. Nervous system surprisingly resilient. The language was cold, dispassionate. There were entries about a neighbor's dog that went missing, and the rabbit Mr. Floppy that ran away. The entry for the rabbit was particularly clinical. Subject 6, Legomorph. Demonstrated fear via elevated heart rate. Termination method, rapid cervical dislocation. Clean. Quick. No consequence. That phrase, no consequence, started appearing more and more. It was a refrain. A mantra. And then, Rostova reached the entries that weren't about animals at all. They were philosophical. Alara was working through the problem of other people. One entry read, they are ruled by sentiment. They see a crying child and feel compassion. A biological error. Compassion is an inefficient allocation of resources. It clouds judgment. Another, the system is designed for the sentimental. They think age and innocence are the same thing. They are not. Age is a number. Innocence is a concept. I am not innocent. I am informed. Rostova felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's air conditioning. This wasn't just a record of cruelty, it was a manifesto. It was the inner monologue of someone who had talked herself into believing she was above the rules of humanity. She wasn't just breaking the law, she was writing her own. And then, Rostova found it. The entry that made her blood run cold. It was dated the week before the murder. The heading was simple, Hypothesis, the human subject. It didn't spell out, I will kill Mr. Clay. Ilara was too smart for that. Instead, it was a series of theoretical questions. What is the threshold of shock required to incapacitate a human male of advanced age? How much force is necessary with a blunt object? How does one stage a narrative that the sentimental will unquestioningly believe? It was all there. The blueprint for the perfect crime, framed as an academic exercise. She had thought through every variable, every possible outcome. Every variable, that is, except one, a detective who had seen this particular brand of monster before. A detective who knew that the most dangerous ghosts aren't the ones that haunt houses, but the ones that haunt the pages of a little girl's journal. They brought Ilara in for a follow-up interview. That's what they called it. Not an interrogation. She sat in a room that was designed to be boring. Beige walls, a scuffed table, a flickering fluorescent light that hummed like an anxious insect. Her feet didn't quite touch the floor. She had a child advocate with her, a woman who looked at Ilara with nothing but protective sympathy. And Ilara? She looked small. Fragile. She'd perfected the art of shrinking into her own youth. Detective Rostova sat across from her, the journal placed on the table between them, but covered by a plain manila folder. She didn't start with the hard questions. She started with soft ones, lulling Ilara into a false sense of security. She asked about school, her friends, her hobbies. And Ilara played her part beautifully. Her answers were those of a bright, slightly shy little girl. But every so often, a $10 word would slip out. A clinical term. A flash of the mind hiding behind the mask. Then, Rostova shifted. Ilara, the night Mr. Clay died, you said you hid in the closet. Can you walk me through that again? From the moment you heard the noise. Ilara's story was flawless. She recited it like a well-rehearsed poem. The big man. The struggle. The hiding. But Rostova listened for the rhythm, the cadence. There was no hesitation, no messy, human emotion. It was a recitation. And you're sure you didn't see his face? Rostova asked, her voice gentle. It was dark, Ilara said, her eyes wide. But you saw he was big. How did you know? A tiny blink. A micro-expression of irritation. I just knew. From his shadow. Rostova nodded, as if this made perfect sense. She was building a cage, one seemingly innocent question at a time. Then, Rostova slowly slid the manila folder aside, revealing the leather-bound journal. Ilara's eyes snapped to it. For the first time, her composure cracked. It was just a hairline fracture, a slight tightening around her mouth, a quick, darting glance at her advocate. But in that room, it was as loud as a gunshot. Do you recognize this, Ilara? Rostova's voice was still calm, but it had weight now. Ilara's mask of innocence hardened into something else. Contempt. That's private. I understand you feel that way. Some of the entries are very advanced for your age. The hypothesis of the human subject. Can you tell me what that means? The child advocate shifted uncomfortably. Detective, is this really necessary? But Ilara didn't wait for an answer. She looked directly at Rostova, and the little girl was gone, replaced by the arrogant architect of her own crime. It's a theoretical exercise, she said, her voice losing its childish lilt. A thought experiment. Are you arresting me for my thoughts? Rostova didn't flinch. I'm interested in why your thoughts about incapacitating a human male happened just days before a human male was incapacitated in your home. Ilara leaned back in her chair, a smug, knowing smile playing on her lips. She had her shield, and she raised it high. I'm 10 years old, she said, the words dripping with condescension. You can't seriously think I could do that. He was a grown man. It's not possible. She looked at her advocate for validation. She was playing the system, and she knew she was winning. The journal was just a book of stories, of dark fairy tales. What could they really do? Rostova watched her, this child monster, so confident in her own invincibility. And in that moment, Rostova knew she wasn't just fighting a killer, she was fighting an idea. The idea that youth is a shield, that intelligence is a weapon that can never be turned back on its owner. The interview ended soon after. No confession. No breakthrough. Just a chilling display of arrogant calculation. As Alara was led from the room, she looked over her shoulder at Rostova, and the smirk was back, fully formed. It was a message, clear as day. You have nothing. You can't touch me. But Rostova saw something else. She saw the rage that had flashed in Alara's eyes when she was challenged. And rage, unlike cold calculation, is messy. It makes mistakes. The trap was set. Now, she just had to wait for the monster to spring at herself. After the interrogation, Alara was sent home, but she was never truly alone. The system, once a set of rules she thought she could manipulate, was now a cage being built around her. Detective Rostova had a uniformed officer drive by the Vance house at random intervals. She had a child psychologist, specializing in forensic evaluation, schedule play therapy sessions. It was all a polite, legal form of siege. The goal wasn't to scare her into a confession. Rostova knew that was impossible, but to annoy her. To make her feel watched. To make her feel ordinary. And for a narcissist, there is no greater torture than being treated as ordinary. Meanwhile, Rostova was in her element, the ghost of Lucas Miller now a full partner in her investigation. She pulled the old files, finding the same chilling patterns. The intellectual arrogance, the belief that emotion was a weakness others had, the meticulous staging. Lucas had been older, his methods cruder, but the blueprint of the mind was the same. She was no longer hunting a burglar. She was profiling a psychological profile. The play therapy was held in a room filled with toys, a place designed to feel safe and unthreatening. Alara hated it. She saw the dolls and blocks as tools for the simple-minded. The psychologist, Dr. Evans, was a gentle man who spoke in soft tones. He didn't ask about the murder. He asked about her interests, her dreams. He asked about her journal. You wrote about some animals, didn't you, Alara? Before Mr. Clay. Alara's guard was up, but she was bored. They were experiments. I see. What was your first subject? A bug. A frog. She shrugged, a gesture of supreme dismissal. It's not important. Dr. Evans nodded, making a note. Sometimes our first subjects are the most memorable. They teach us the most. Later that day, Rostova paid a visit to the Vance home. It was a social call, ostensibly. She spoke with Alara's parents in the living room, her voice carrying easily into the hall where Alara was pretending to read. Rostova's tone was conversational, almost casual. We've been reviewing some of the older entries in the journal, Rostova said, her voice clear and calm. Trying to build a complete picture. It's fascinating, the level of detail. Even the very early ones. Like the rabbit. Alara didn't move, but every muscle in her back tightened. Mr. Floppy, wasn't it? Rostova continued, as if recalling a minor detail. The entry was so precise. Rapid cervical dislocation. You noted it was clean. Quick. The name. She used the name. Alara had never written the name in the journal. It was just Subject 6, Legomorph. But Rostova, through dogged investigation, had cross-referenced the timeline with a missing pet report from years ago. She had found the name. Mr. Floppy. It was the personalization of it. The reduction of her clean, clinical experiment to a sentimental memory. It was an insult to her intellect. Alara spun around from her book, her face a thundercloud of rage. The composed prodigy was gone. In her place was a furious, cornered child. His name wasn't important, she shrieked, her voice cutting through the polite conversation in the living room. He was a subject, a variable. You don't understand anything. The silence that followed was absolute. Her parents stared, their mouths agape. The mask of their quiet, composed daughter lay in pieces on the floor. Detective Rostova didn't smile. She simply met Alara's furious gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of triumph. It was an acknowledgement. Hello, monster. There you are. The crack wasn't wide. It didn't lead to a confession. But it was a vital fracture in her flawless armor, and through it, everyone finally got a glimpse of the roaring fire inside. The setting shifted from the messy, emotional world of houses and interrogations to a place where emotion was meant to be stripped away, the courtroom. It was a chamber of polished wood and cold, marble floors. The air smelled of old paper, lemon-scented polish, and a faint, metallic tang of tension. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent, leaving no shadow untouched. This was a machine built for one purpose: to find truth. Or at least, a version of it that could be agreed upon. And in this new, sterile arena, the players took their positions. The judge, a woman with a face like a closed ledger, high on her bench. The prosecutors with their stacks of binders and grim determination. The defense attorney, who would paint a picture of a confused, traumatized child. And the jury, a panel of ordinary people asked to weigh an extraordinary crime. They were the audience, and they looked upon Ilara with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Ilara Vance saw it differently. To her, this wasn't a machine of justice. It was her final and greatest stage. She was dressed for the part, a simple, blue dress, her hair in 2 neat braids, an image of youthful vulnerability crafted by her defense team. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes were alive, scanning the room, assessing every player. She saw the slow, ritualistic procedures, the careful language, the way the judge spoke in calm, measured tones. She misinterpreted it all. She didn't see gravity, she saw gentleness. She didn't see order, she saw weakness. This, to her, was the ultimate proof that the system was built to coddle, to protect. It was a world of sentiment, and she was the one person in the room who operated without it. A smirk, small and controlled, touched her lips. This was a game she was built to win. The prosecution stood. They didn't start with the murder. They started with the journal. They put it on the projector, and those cold, clinical words were displayed on a screen for everyone to see. The entries about the cats, the dog, the rabbit. The room grew colder with each word. They were showing the jury the monster's blueprint, the gradual escalation. Ilara's defense attorney argued this was the work of a brilliant, disturbed mind acting out fantasy. A cry for help, he called it. He spoke of her age, her isolation, the pressure of being a prodigy. And through it all, Ilara sat. She listened to the gruesome details of her own actions discussed in dry, legal terms, and she felt a thrill. This was her masterpiece being analyzed. They were all talking about her. Her intelligence, her methods. It was a form of admiration, in her twisted view. She caught Detective Rostova's eye from across the room. Rostova's expression was unreadable, but Ilara's smirk widened, just for a second. It was a silent message. You see? They are all playing their parts. And my part is the victim. It's so easy. But she was wrong. The stage was set, but the script was about to be rewritten. And the star of the show was about to discover that this particular stage had a trapdoor, and she was standing right on top of it. The prosecution's first witness was the child psychologist, Dr. Evans. He didn't talk about the murder. He talked about the mind. In calm, precise language, he described a personality structure devoid of empathy. He used words like grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and a profound lack of remorse. He explained that for such an individual, other people are not felt as living, breathing beings, but as objects, as tools or obstacles. The journal, Dr. Evans said, is not a cry for help. It is a logbook. The subjects, including the human subject, Mr. Clay, were simply experiments. The goal was not to express emotion, but to gather data and prove a hypothesis, that she could do it, and that there would be no consequence. Ilara listened to this, her head tilted. She wasn't offended. She was intrigued. She was being studied, and she found the process fascinating. The defense, on cross-examination, tried to paint this as a theory, an opinion. But the seed was planted in the jury's mind. This was not a normal child. Next came the forensic expert. He walked the jury through the crime scene photos, but his real focus was on the journal entry titled Hypothesis, the human subject. He placed it side by side with the evidence. The journal hypothesizes about the force necessary with a blunt object, he stated. The murder weapon was a brass bookend, consistent with that description. It discusses staging a narrative. The broken window, the stolen jewels, the positioned body, all consistent with a staged narrative designed to mislead. Most crucially, he continued, his voice dropping, the journal explicitly considers the threshold of shock required to incapacitate a human male of advanced age. The single, precise blow to the back of Mr. Clay's head was exactly that, an efficient, calculated act of incapacitation. It was not a struggle. It was an execution. For the first time, Ilara's smirk faded. She didn't like this. This man was reducing her artistry to a series of cold, clinical points. He was turning her masterpiece into a checklist. Her hands tightened in her lap. Then, they called Detective Eva Rostova. She didn't look at the jury at first. She looked at Ilara. And she spoke not just as a detective, but as someone who had seen this shadow before. She described the too-perfect crime scene. The lack of the smell of fear in the closet. The calculated performance in the interrogation. And then, she brought the ghost of Lucas Miller into the room. I've seen this pattern before, she said, her voice steady but heavy. A brilliant, narcissistic individual who believes the rules are for other people. Who sees the world as a game they cannot lose. With Lucas Miller, it was arson. With Ilara Vance, it is murder. The methodology is different, but the blueprint of the mind is the same. They are both architects of their own actions, convinced their intelligence is a shield. The defense objected. Speculation. Relevance. The judge overruled. The witness may continue, as it pertains to pattern of behavior. Rostova turned her gaze to the jury. Ilara Vance did not make a mistake. She made a choice. She chose to treat a human life as an experiment. And she is sitting here today because she suffers from a fatal flaw that all such arrogant monsters share. She believes we are too sentimental, too stupid, to see her for what she is. It was the word monster that did it. It was the final, unforgivable reduction. She was not a genius, not an artist. She was a monster. Ilara could no longer stay silent. As Rostova stepped down from the stand, Ilara shot to her feet, her small body trembling with a rage she could no longer contain. She doesn't know anything. Ilara's voice, shrill and sharp, cut through the formal quiet of the courtroom. She's just a stupid, sentimental cop. They're all stupid. I'm smarter than all of you. Her defense attorney tried to pull her down, to shush her. The judge slammed her gavel. But the damage was done. The performance was over. The mask of the innocent child lay shattered on the polished floor. The jury saw not a victim, not a confused little girl, but the furious, arrogant architect Rostova had described. The testimony was over, but the truth had finally spoken for itself. After Ilara's outburst, the judge called for a recess. The air in the courtroom was electric, buzzing with the unspoken truth that had finally broken free. But while the spectators filed out, whispering, the real drama moved behind closed doors. This is where the chess game was really being played, and the prosecution had been holding a queen in reserve the entire time. In the judge's chambers, away from the jury's ears, the lead prosecutor laid a single, thin legal brief on the desk. It wasn't flashy. It was almost humble. But the case it cited was a sledgehammer. It was known as in re. Stevens, a case from 15 years prior, so obscure most lawyers had never heard of it. In re. Stevens was about a boy, Jeremy Stevens, aged 12. A prodigy, like Ilara. He had set a fire that killed 2 people, a fire he later bragged about in a private blog, detailing the chemical compounds he used to maximize the spread. He was smug, arrogant, and believed his youth was an impenetrable shield. The juvenile system at the time was not equipped for him. He saw therapy as a game, manipulation as a tool. The precedent set by his case was narrow, specific, and terrifying. It allowed for a juvenile, in cases demonstrating extreme premeditation, psychological sophistication, and a proven lack of amenability to rehabilitation within the standard system, to be remanded to a state psychiatric facility until age 21. It wasn't a juvenile detention center with a release date. It was a high-security hospital for the criminally insane, where the primary goal wasn't punishment, but containment and study. The minimum commitment was not a few years, it was a decade of their young life. The prosecutor's argument was simple and devastating. He laid out the parallels. The journal was Ilara's blog. Mr. Clay was her fire. Her performance in the interrogation and her outburst in the courtroom were proof of her lack of amenability. She was not a child who made a terrible mistake. She was a sophisticated, dangerous individual who happened to be housed in a child's body. The standard system, built on the hope of redemption, had nothing to offer her. The defense attorney argued, of course. He called it draconian. He said it criminalized intelligence. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The judge listened, her face impassive. She had the brief. She had the journal. She had just witnessed the monster for herself. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The lawyers' voices were tighter. The judge's instructions to the jury were heavier. Nothing was said aloud to the gallery, but the truth had a weight you could feel. A door had been opened to a possibility far darker than anyone had imagined. Ilara was still smirking, confident the worst she faced was a few years in juvie. But the adults in the room now knew the terrible truth. They were no longer debating a sentence. They were debating a quarantine. The day of the sentencing arrived. There was no more evidence to present, no more arguments to be made. The courtroom was a vessel filled with a thick, heavy silence, waiting to be cracked open. Ilara sat at the defense table, wearing the same simple blue dress. But the performance was over. The smirk was present, but it was brittle now, a fragile shield against a verdict she could no longer predict. She kept glancing at the judge, at the jury, searching for a sign of the gentle sentiment she still believed would save her. She saw only stone. Her parents sat in the first row, their faces pale and hollowed out. They were ghosts in their own lives, mourning a daughter they never truly knew. Detective Rostova sat in the back, a silent observer. She felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of a difficult job completed, and a profound sorrow for the lives broken along the way. The judge adjusted her glasses. The rustle of paper was deafening. She spoke without drama, her voice a flat, calm river of facts. She summarized the case, the meticulous planning, the cold-blooded execution, the utter lack of remorse. She referenced the journal, the testimony, the psychological evaluations. And then, she came to the reason for her decision. The court finds, she said, her words falling like stones, that the respondent, Ilara Vance, presents a profound and clear danger to the community. She possesses a level of psychological sophistication and a capacity for manipulation that far exceeds her chronological age. The standard juvenile system is not equipped to manage, treat, or contain this individual. Ilara's brittle smirk began to falter. This wasn't the language of compassion. This was the language of a problem being disposed of. The judge took a final breath. Therefore, pursuant to the statute and the precedent of Henry Stevens, it is the order of this court that Ilara Vance be remanded to the Birchwood Secure Psychiatric Facility for a period of no less than 10 years, after which her case will be reviewed by a state board to determine if she remains a threat to society. The words hung in the air. Birchwood. It wasn't a school. It wasn't a detention center. It was a place for the broken and the dangerous, where minds were studied, not nurtured, where her intelligence would be seen as a symptom, not a virtue. 10 years. Her entire childhood, and then some. It was an erasure. The gavel came down. Crack. And the smirk on the 10-year-old girl's face didn't just falter. It shattered. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes, once so full of arrogant calculation, went wide with a raw, bottomless terror. She looked at her parents, but they were weeping, unable to meet her gaze. She looked at the bailiff moving toward her, and she finally understood. Her age was not a shield. Her intelligence was not a weapon. It was her diagnosis. And the sentence was not a timeout. It was a life sentence, in a cage she could not outsmart. It wasn't a dramatic scream. It was an implosion. A silent, violent sucking in of the world as she knew it. The smirk on Ilara's face didn't just fade, it collapsed under the weight of a truth she could no longer deflect. Her lips, once curled in perpetual condescension, went slack. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculation, glazed over with a dawning, horrific understanding. This wasn't a juvenile detention center with a library and a release date. This was Birchwood. A place for the broken. A place where her prized intellect wouldn't be admired. It would be picked apart, analyzed as a symptom of her sickness. She would be a specimen. A subject. Just like the ants, the frog, the rabbit. The poet had become the poem. The scientist was being reduced to her own lab rat. A small, pathetic sound escaped her throat, a whimper, the first genuine, uncalculated sound she'd made since this began. Her hands, which had always been so still and controlled, began to shake uncontrollably. She looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. This was the consequence. This was the variable her perfect equation had never accounted for. Not the sentimental weakness of adults, but the cold, unyielding machinery of the law applied to someone it deemed inhuman. She searched the room for an anchor, for a single face that reflected the outrage she felt. But her parents were crumpled, broken. The jury looked away. Detective Rostova's gaze was steady, but it held no gloat, only a grim finality. There was no audience left for her performance. The stage had vanished, and she was just a terrified little girl, alone in a bright, silent void of her own making. As the bailiff's hand settled on her shoulder, she didn't resist. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the raw, bottomless terror of the cage. The game was over. And she had lost. Not because she wasn't smart enough, but because she was finally, utterly, alone. 6 months later, the rain came again to Cedar Creek, washing the streets with the same quiet efficiency. But on Hemlock Drive, one house stood dark. A for sale sign was staked into the perfect lawn, its posts slightly tilted. The windows were empty eyes. No light warmed the kitchen. No microscope sat in the bedroom. The Vance family was gone. They'd moved away, trying to outrun the ghost of the daughter they'd never really known. The neighborhood, of course, had moved on. The lawns were still manicured. The streets were still quiet. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was knowing. The biggest monster hadn't been a stranger breaking in. It had been raised behind one of these very doors. So what do we take from this? What's the lesson in the story of Alara Vance? It's that monsters aren't born under the bed, or in the shadows of a dark forest. They are raised in plain sight. In houses with neat lawns and quiet streets. They are polished and perfected, their arrogance fed by every unchallenged thought, until they make their one fatal mistake. They start to believe their own reflection. Alara finally learned what consequence felt like. It wasn't a shout, or a punishment, or a tearful apology. It was the sound of a heavy door locking behind her in a place where her genius meant nothing. It was the sound of the world, finally, refusing to play her game. And on a quiet street in Cedar Creek, the only sound left is the rain, trying its best to wash it all away.